The great thing about Casios is they're so cheap. There are numerous fun retro watches that you can grab for barely any cash. The only caveat is that most of them also look like they cost barely any cash. If they're not made of black plastic or shiny chromed resin, they'll usually ship with a garbage tier bracelet or a clunky design that only a mother could love. Well, most of them, that is. Over the past few years, I've showcased some of Casio's hidden gems, the watches that Casio got right in every department. And that got me thinking, why haven't I made a video specifically searching out some of these bargain bangers? The watches that seem to outdo their price tag, if you will. Well, here it is. I've spent the last few weeks scouring the Casio catalogue, and today I'm bringing you the cream of the Casio crop. 15 of the best Casio watches that I could find that look way more expensive than they actually are. I bought and tested every one of these, as well as a bunch of others, and as a result, some didn't make the cut, which I'll mention in a second. The ones that did make the list are linked in the video description if you want to go and check them out. And the best part is, many of these have never been covered on YouTube before, so it's probably your first time seeing them. Honourable mentions go out to the MTP B155 and MTP V006, which could be excellent, but are almost impossible to find despite being relatively new. Meanwhile, the MTP B120 and B125 both looked great online, but in person looked really cheap, despite one of them having an elaborate dial texture. The Edifice EFB108 is a decent choice that's just made obsolete by other offerings on this list, while the highly popular MTP 1302, aka the Casio Datejust, may bear a passing resemblance to a Rolex, but has a brass case that looks and feels dreadful in the flesh. Now for the main list, which I'll group into sections for easy browsing. We'll kick off with the shortest category, digitals. Now there aren't many expensive digital watches out there, so there isn't really a decent point of comparison. I'd say the swankiest looking Casio is probably the A700. Now I've praised this line before for offering a decent backlight and an incredibly slim profile at a low price. That said, it also has other advantages over most Casio digitals. The WEV variant, for example, has a much leaner, clutter-free design than most, which inherently just looks less tacky, as well as a glamorous, glossy display surround that plays with the light nicely. These also have nicer bracelets than most too, including either this segmented option that matches the indented case, or a higher quality steel Milanese bracelet that arguably looks even better. It's topped by a mineral crystal too, which will pick up less scratches than the acrylic on most cheap digitals, and of course the whole package, it just looks great. An honourable mention also goes to the A1000. That model even has a steel case unlike the A700, though the design isn't nearly as elegant, and the best looking version, the dark A1000M, is plagued by a disastrous negative display that's dimmer than my nan's Wi-Fi signal. She doesn't even have the internet. Thankfully, Casio has several decent Ana-Digi watches to make up the shortfall. Two fantastic budget choices are the AQ230 and AQ800. Now these watches, they don't look super expensive or anything, but particular versions have some really neat characteristics that help them look more premium than their price tag. First up is the AQ230, or in this case specifically the AQ230GA. For the most part, it's like many other cheap gold-colored Casios, with low-quality materials and unremarkable construction. Yet it has this stunning chocolate brown dial with an irresistible sunburst that I can't help but admire. Sure, it's flashy, perhaps even a little tacky, but I think it looks absolutely amazing for around $50, sometimes less. It's one of those watches that looks far better in person than on camera, by the way, so I'd certainly recommend trying one if you can. It's a similar story with the AQ800. This is more of a segmented watch and perhaps not as good looking. Nevertheless, it carries some equally intriguing dial options, including a sunburst blue and a graph paper-like grid line pattern, both of which look surprisingly solid. Now, the big drawback of these cheap Ana-Digis, aside from their materials, is that they've got no backlight, and they are quite small. If you can live with that, they're very fun little pieces that look better than the stock images would have you believe. For something higher quality, the LCW M100T SE from the Lineage range is a phenomenal choice. This is one of my most worn watches of all time, with its lightweight titanium case, sapphire crystal, and solar-powered movement, which also has radio wave time syncing for perfect accuracy. All that is good and great, but the real star of the show, again, is the dial. This one is like nothing else I've seen. It may be a side effect of the solar cells or something, because it boasts this remarkable iridescent sunburst that exudes a rainbow of colours from its grey surface. It's hard to capture on camera, but Hopefully some of these shots will give you an idea. I'm yet to see such a clean sunburst elsewhere. It's one very special piece. It's not a perfect one though. The case does accrue scratches quite readily compared to steel, and it's not the most versatile when it comes to straps, so you'll have to make do with the middle-of-the-road bracelet. Additionally, the most readily available versions of this bestseller are alternate versions with slightly different number-adorned dials, though they do appear to be identical otherwise. As far as dive watches go, it's hard to look past the venerable Casio Duro. The MDV 106, or in its modern guise, the MDV 107, is a monster of a dive watch that's still Casio's best by far. It's not only extremely robust for the money, but it looks and feels it too, with a weighty, well-finished case and a detailed dial that includes a decent sunburst and applied markers. The bezel also looks and feels better than most similarly priced big brand offerings, with the imposing 44mm size being the only point of contention. It really is big, but if you have the wrist for it, the Duro is a great contender that's available for around $50 in the US. It's not quite as well priced in other territories like the UK, but it's still far better than the majority of high street dive watches at this sort of cost. You may think the smaller MDV 10 would be a great compact alternative, but sadly, you'd be mistaken. I tried that one and found that Casio had skimped in virtually every department. So while it looks similar on the surface, the MDV 10 has far worse construction across the board, to the extent that my unit shockingly failed before I even finished my review. No joke, it died right after filming. So yeah, avoid that one at all costs, even if it is tempting. While there aren't many more divers that have the premium look of the Duro, thankfully Casio does offer some very strong sports-style watches. The obvious candidate here is the EFR S108D. This is part of their racing-inspired Edifice line, and it boasts an angular, aggressive case with an octagonal bezel akin to more expensive watches like the AP Royal Oak. While this $100 watch isn't nearly as well made as those, obviously, it does look surprisingly good at arm's length, with stylish vertical brushing and incredible thinness. Casio recently revamped this line with metallic dials such as this green one, which look much more premium than the monochrome wood effect dials the S108D originally launched with. It's got good specs like high water resistance and a sapphire crystal, but suffers for an average integrated bracelet and mediocre legibility due to the haziness of the crystal. If you can find it, the EFR S107 is a similarly styled larger alternative that appears to have been discontinued. Still, both options are better than the bulkier EFB version I mentioned at the start, and they look much more expensive in person for the sake of this list. The similarly good EFV100 and EFV110 are sporadically available from grey market retailers. This is a smooth bezel watch that comes in two sizes, 35mm and 40mm, each with a stylish Omega-like design, including a sleek, swept case that looks a little like a Star Wars fighter jet. With big water resistance and a screw-down crown, it's performant too, though its days seem to be numbered as availability is inconsistent at best. Other colours seem to be more accessible, which is why it's still on this list, but the black model, which I really liked, is getting harder to find. The same applies to the EFV140D, which appears to be the same watch just with an impressive striped dial instead. I'm very jealous if that one's still available in your territory, because I never got to take a look at it. A newer model that is more widely available is the MTP B145. A lot of people were calling this the PRX killer because of its resemblance to the Tissot PRX, though this one has the advantage of a standalone bracelet, meaning you can switch it out much more easily. The B145 only scrapes its way onto this list because some elements like the case and markers do look rudimentary up close. That said, at a glance, it's quite impressive with a punchy selection of dials to pick from, each packed into a wafer-thin package that hugs the wrist rather nicely. The main downside of this piece is the subpar bracelet, surprise surprise, which offers no micro-adjustment holes, so you could well get unlucky with the fit. What you see really is what you get with this one. A small, sporty, fashionable watch with visual similarities to some of the more popular integrated bracelet models, only for far less money. While the B145 is arguably a little overrated, the little-known MTP RS100D is my pick for the most underrated Casio on this list. It's currently available on several grey market sites in a range of colours for around $70 to $90 a pop, or around £80 to £100. For that, you get a surprisingly handsome solar-powered watch with nice markers and a cool honeycomb chapter ring. I was mostly intrigued by the brown version, though sadly it appears to be region exclusive, so I settled for this blue one instead. Even this model is quite vivid, offering up a distinctive space-age vibe thanks to the side bulges and machine-like bezel. As is a running theme with these Casios, The bracelet is the primary weak spot, mainly because of the mock end links and tricky L pins which you have to hammer out to change the length. Luckily, the stock band does integrate well with custom detailing to match the lugs, and you get a couple of micro adjustment holes to tinker with too, but it's still not the best. If you're after a larger watch that offers solar charging for a low price, the stylish design of the RS100D may be enough for you to overlook its flaws. It's somewhere between 44 and 47mm depending on where you measure, so it's not for the faint-wristed. A few years back, there would have been no chronographs on a list like this. Casio really didn't have very many, but now we have a string to choose from, mainly thanks to Casio's sporty edifice line. The pieces bearing this name, by the way, just tend to be higher quality, and they usually look higher quality as well. The hottest of these is undoubtedly the EFB 730D. Now, this piece was clearly inspired by some of the boxier vintage Zenith chronographs, as well as their recent reissues, with a comparable barrel-like case shape and a string of similar design cues. In other words, this Casio looks pretty expensive. Indeed, this has an extreme grainy sunburst that catches the light magnificently, as well as enhanced case finishing above the majority on this list. In fact, this model seems to be the chosen one, as Casio not only outfitted this with a sapphire crystal, but they also gave this a much better bracelet than most Casios, with primarily solid links throughout, and even custom fit end links that slot in perfectly. This chronograph is a stunning strap monster that would easily be number one if I were ranking these in any sort of order. It's even quite a versatile size at exactly 40mm across, and each of the 3 color combinations you can pick from are excellent. For around $100 or £100, you simply can't go wrong with this one, which looks like it's worth 5 or 10 times that much. Oh, and you can always time stuff with the bottom subdial if you want to, because it's a chronograph, but you'll probably be too busy fawning over the dial to care. Now, that last one set the bar unfairly high, but surprisingly, there are some options that come relatively close, albeit with a less flashy approach. The EFR 574 and EQS 950 are 2 such examples. These are subtler alternatives that don't look premium through jazzy colors or bright sunbursts, but through finer details instead. They've got texture-rich ringed subdials with glossy surrounds that help them catch the light when you rotate them. My favorite of the 2 is definitely the EFR 574, which is much slimmer and has a more symmetrical, attractive design, as well as a steel tachymeter bezel that I just think looks stylish, together with rather elaborate hovering markers that I only noticed when reviewing my macro footage. It looks like some of those video game steps that retract into the wall if you're not quick enough. It's a handsome, sporty choice that's pretty versatile to boot, with high water resistance and a perfectly integrated bracelet, which is a rarity at this price. It cost me just over £100, but price and availability may vary depending on where you live. Unlike most edifice chronographs, it's not too busy or massive either. It's got a wearable 47.2mm lug-to-lug and a dial that looks proportionally on point. The EQS 950 is a bit bulkier and not quite as pretty, but it packs some additional tricks up its sleeve. Notably, it has the best constructed case on this list, with extra clean finishing that wouldn't look out of place on a watch at triple the price, as well as the heftiest feel, even beating out the Duro dive watch. The integrated bracelet would typically be a cause for concern given it's trickier to replace. Luckily, the EQS has one of the best bracelets on any Casio, with solid steel links and seamless case-match brushing and polishing. With loads of micro adjustment holes, you won't need to replace this in a hurry. What's more, the 950 is solar powered, meaning you won't have to worry about battery changes either, the solar panels for which are baked into the subdials, giving them a high-end iridescent sheen, a little bit like the Casio lineage I mentioned earlier. Despite the substantial on-paper dimensions, it wears surprisingly compactly as well, so as long as you have an average-sized wrist, say around 6 3/4 inches or larger, it should still fit you. Next up is the sporty Edifice EFV 640D. This model comes in an extensive range of metallic tones, including several lighter pastel colors such as this mint green variant. Despite the more simplistic case versus those last 2, I'd say it's better looking overall, with a cleaner dial and an intriguing lipped bezel made up of a circular brush portion on top of a polished octagonal base. It's minimalist as far as chronographs go, with little added text or clutter. While not the most unique nor the most detailed, the metallic dial and familiar styling help elevate this one beyond its moderate price tag, which varies from between $75 and $120. It's a very similar story with the EFR 526, which shares the same price bracket. While it lacks finesse up close with simplistic hands on the subdials, the sleek bezel and subdued blue-green sunburst meant I had to at least give it an honorable mention here, even if it doesn't look as premium as some of the others. The case is rather basic and the bracelet isn't particularly cohesive either, but I suspect a quick strap change could be all this one needs to become a keeper. More on the 526 in a future video. Dress watches aren't the first thing that comes to mind when you think of Casio, but they do have a fair few in their repertoire, including this, the MTP E720. While the handset is far from my favourite, it has some pretty obvious standout features that meant I simply had to include it. Of course, that highly textured dial is the main attention grabber. It's a play on the typical waffle dial with microscopic triangular divots that give the illusion of interlocking squares, almost looking like they've got a diagonal cut through them. Considering I paid around £50 for this watch, I think it's quite impressive, though I was equally impressed by the case, which didn't look like much online, but in reality it's not just thin, but also quite well finished, especially the polishing at the base of the bezel. Now the domed mineral crystal does inhibit the legibility more than I'd like. I think a flat crystal would have looked better and clearer, but even so, this is a well-rounded low-cost dress watch with a usable leather band. You get some excellent light play, even if it's a little tricky to read. It also comes in various colours and competes well with many pricier dress watches, a true hidden gem. Rather like the watch in the video linked on screen now, a high-end Japanese Casio with some nifty functions and features. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe. I've got a list of the best looking Casios coming just around the corner.